Hello and welcome to Pathways, where you are invited to join me for a visit with leaders in personal development and cultural evolution. This is your host, Paul O'Brien. Today's show is about trauma and forgiveness, and we consider the question, is forgiveness really a necessary part of recovering from trauma? Trauma survivors are often told to forgive their offenders, but that injunction is a common reason they might avoid mental health services and support. This pressure to forgive can, in fact, unknowingly cause harm and sabotage their recovery. Today's guest suggests that such harm is entirely unnecessary, and perhaps forgiveness is as well. Our guest is Amanda Ann Gregory, author of the book, You Don't Need to Forgive: Trauma Recovery on Your Own Terms. Amanda is a trauma psychotherapist whose work focuses on complex trauma recovery. Her unique perspective as both a clinician and a trauma survivor allows her to deeply understand the needs of survivors. Her writing has appeared in publications such as Psychology Today, Psychotherapy Networker, and psychotherapy.net. With over 17 years of clinical practice alongside EMDR and National Counseling certifications, Amanda has provided trauma education and training for the American Counseling Association, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, Ronald McDonald House Charities, among others. Well, hello, Amanda, and welcome to the Pathways Show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's a very interesting book, in particular because of your personal story, and you yourself are a trauma survivor. And I'm just going to tell a little bit of your story from out of the book, which is when you were a child, there were colonies of cockroaches. I mean, you lived in a very impoverished environment, and you and your brother would see how many you could squash with your bare feet. And I'm going to quote you, we'd push and shove each other to sabotage the other's success, yet we could never keep track of our kills, which caused heated late night arguments. And this is one of my happiest childhood memories. Unquote. Wow. That is it's incredible that this was a happy memory. Can you unpack that for us a little bit?
I think it really speaks to the resiliency of children and really, getting through and surviving by any means necessary. And I would say even to this day, there are moments where I will bring up a memory to people and I will look at their face and I will say, oh, that's a sad memory, isn't it? Because sometimes I don't know because it was my normal. It was
Right.
my status quo.
Yeah, I can relate to that as a fellow survivor of CPTSD, but I didn't have the as bad a situation as you did. And you mentioned that you had a constant reminder in your childhood that your mother matters, but you don't. And I share that experience too. Um, and so you've had this struggle in terms of your recovery from whether you could or even needed to forgive your parents. So let's talk about this issue because what is forgiveness and what is it not?
Right. That's so tough. And the hard thing about forgiveness is that in the field of psychology, we don't agree on a definition. There's not one
Right.
definition that all researchers are using, that all therapists are using. There's not one. Now, we do agree on certain things that forgiveness isn't, which I think is a really great place to start.
Okay.
So the biggest one that I hear people come up with, and it's usually the biggest shocker, is that forgiveness is not reconciliation.
Okay.
We can forgive someone and never speak to them again. They cannot be a part of our life. They're not the same thing. Can forgiveness lead to reconciliation? Sure, but it's not the same thing. They're very different.
And it's not necessary to
No, it's
you.
not. And forgiveness isn't forgetting, too. I really don't like the term forgive and forget because forgiveness isn't amnesia. It's
Right.
not. We retain the memory of it. We just tend to feel different about it. And some of the things that we do agree on what forgiveness is a change in our thoughts, our emotions, our actions towards our offender. We don't necessarily agree on how much that change is. Some people will say, well, if you've forgiven, you love them or you like them. Other people will say, absolutely not. Maybe just considering them a human being, but you don't have to like or love them. So we tend to argue about that.
And what part does acceptance play?
Acceptance is actually not forgiveness at all. They're two separate concepts, but a lot of times the change in our emotions, our thoughts, and behaviors are kind of the same. Acceptance is more, I'm at a place of peace that this happened to me, or I experienced this, or this relationship is over. I could actually still be angry at the person and experience acceptance. So it has less likely to do with my thoughts, feelings, behaviors towards the person, and more about the situation, or at times just even about myself.
Right. Now, you point out that when forgiveness is forced, it can cause harm. And so how can imposing forgiveness sabotage trauma recovery?
So many ways. I think the most obvious one is it could put survivors in situations that are dangerous. They could be continuing relationships with people who are abusive, and that could be physical abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse. All types of abuses carry harm. One isn't worse necessarily than the other. And also, it really disrupts the natural trauma recovery process. So when people recover from trauma, we will see some similar attributes. So, for example, they usually need to focus on creating safety and feeling safe enough to do the work. There
Right.
is a lot of emotional processing and integration. So, we have to be able to get angry. We have to welcome that and feel safe enough to do that, and also embrace grief. And also, challenging shame comes up a lot, which you've already mentioned. I
Right.
was raised to believe that my mother matters, I don't. And as I grew up and left the home, my brain then linked that to other people and myself. So then it became this sort of huge belief of shame of, I don't matter. Everybody else matters more than I do. And I had to challenge that. And so
Right.
when forgiveness comes into the picture too soon, or it's forced, it tends to be all about forgiveness and not about some of these other things that we need to do.
Right. And you have formulated a thesis that forgiveness should be considered an elective option, not a requirement for trauma recovery. So let's talk about trauma because recovery from trauma might be different than recovery from, anxiety or depression. And trauma has become kind of a buzzword, I didn't get what I want and it was traumatic, etc. So what is trauma?
Trauma is something that we go through. It can be event, it could be experiences, it could be a whole childhood, and it is prolonged emotional dysregulation that
Okay.
tends to impact multiple phases of your life, not just one thing. So it can impact your identity, your self worth, your body. Trauma gets stuck in the body. So we have sensations that linger for years, even if we can't feel them. They're
Right.
deep, deep down. Trauma impacts our feelings of safety. It's much more intense than distress. So sometimes when people are using trauma as a buzzword, I say, okay, are you talking about something that has hung around for a long period of time that you feel stuck in some way? That's trauma. Is it temporary distress? Then we can call it that. It's distressful, but not necessarily traumatic.
Okay, and so there's different levels of trauma, I guess. There's the concepts of the big trauma and the little trauma. Um, can you unpack that?
Sure. So sometimes we will call them big T, little t to
Right.
identify them in the field of psychology. A big T, I think, is what we tend to think of trauma. It's usually one event or a few events are the very same. So, for example, if I am a victim of a shooting, that would be a big T. And that is typically what we see with PTSD and that diagnosis. Now, the little t's are this accumulation of experiences that are all clustered. And there might be many, it might go over a long time. It is much more pervasive, it's much more
Right.
complex, and that's where we come up with complex trauma, not just PTSD. It's very different.
You write, I do not consider myself an anxious person. Instead, I consider myself a trauma survivor. Trauma is my core and anxiety is my symptom. Unquote. That's very interesting because I imagine that applies to a lot of people that have been diagnosed with an anxiety disorder.
Absolutely. And it is so tough. In fact, there's some clinicians that say, if we revamped our diagnosis and really looked at trauma, we could probably get rid of a lot of diagnoses that are out there and really focus on the core. And it's really tough to know if you've experienced trauma. In the book, I say, I think I was about 32 before I realized that I'm a trauma survivor. And let's think about that for a moment. I got a master's degree in counseling, and I had been
Right.
practicing for years, and I had been specializing in trauma, and I didn't know until I was 32. That's interesting, and that happens to a lot of people. I get a lot of clients later in life that they just don't know because it's that little T, and it's always been their reality.
Right. That's right. It seems normal. I felt that way growing up. I thought everybody's family was, that my family was normal, and actually was anything but. Um, and you point out that traumatized human beings recover in the context of relationships. Actually, that was written by Vander Koch, The Body Keeps the Score. And you quote um, that it's become common knowledge that survivors heal within relationship. Well, it seems to me trauma comes out of relationships, and relationships is part of the remedy.
Absolutely. And that could be very confusing for people because they're like, wait a minute, it was other people that put me in this state. And now you're telling me that other people need to be involved in my healing. And that's
Right.
true. But we're actually talking about people who are both safe and capable. Those are the people that we need to be around and help in our healing because they help to create that safety for us. They show us our self worth. Children are not born with self worth. Children don't know they have value. They have no understanding of that concept. It's the adults in their life that show them, not tell them, but show them. And so even as we get older and we're around these people, they can start showing us and we can start internalizing.
You point out that we have to feel safe in order to forgive, and we also have to address our shame before we seek to forgive. Why then are we constantly encouraged to forgive? What's going on?
I think a lot of things, first, people just don't know. People don't realize that trauma survivors are a unique population. And so there are certain experiences that they need to have before they may be capable of certain things. I have noticed that survivors that don't feel safe enough to forgive or don't have a level of self worth, it's very difficult for them to experience genuine forgiveness for someone who abused them. Other populations, it might be different. And I also think that this push to forgive is also based in these myths about forgiveness. The myth that forgiveness is a panacea. It's going to heal everything. It's going to help everybody. Forgiveness can never do any harm. It's great. That, unfortunately, is just not true.
Right. So, how do you advise your clients to respond to someone who's pressuring them to forgive before they're ready?
Oh, and I think that is going to be depending upon the relationship. Sometimes if we don't have that close connective relationship with someone who's safe and capable, it might be something as simple as thank you for your advice. And that's it. And that's all we say. And we move
Right.
on knowing that, I probably don't need to do that. For people we're closest to, we might share some of this information. We might say things like, I tried and it didn't work. Or actually, I'm focusing on healing my trauma right now. And maybe I'll consider, forgiveness at a later date. Sometimes when people are pressuring or encouraging us to forgive, it's about them. It has nothing to do with us. So sometimes considering that is really beneficial and saying things such as, why would you like me to forgive? What are you hoping to get from this? Could actually maybe help the other person get some insight.
Right. And you write the decision to forgive starts a difficult process that involves conquering negative feelings and acting with goodwill towards someone who harmed us. How do you, what's the process? How do you take somebody through that?
And it's going to be unique for each person. If a trauma survivor is, let's say, wanting to forgive, and many do, they want to forgive. Wonderful. Let's look at that. I always say, I think it's important that you address these other things first that usually obstruct forgiveness. So we get everything out of your way to forgive. Do you feel safe enough? Can we build that safety? Do you feel safe in your relationships? Have you processed those emotions associated with your trauma that deserve to be felt and acknowledged and integrated so they can start to change? How do those physical sensations need to start leaving your body because they no longer serve a purpose? Do you have enough self-worth to forgive? If not, can we start challenging that shame? all these factors coming into play. I've worked with many clients that have come in and said, don't ask me to forgive, please don't. My last therapist kept asking me to forgive. I couldn't, or I didn't want to. Don't do that. We took it off the table. We embraced elective forgiveness, which means it's optional always. We can focus on it. We cannot. Sometimes forgiveness shows up organically, which is wonderful. And some of these clients end up forgiving. And it's a shock to them. They're like, I didn't mean to do this. I was like, well, you kind of worked on all the stuff that was in your way. So
Right.
forgiveness just naturally happened.
It's not helpful to make somebody feel guilty about not being ready to go to forgiveness. And there's so much pressure, and some of it comes from religion. You point out in the book that forgiveness and religion can be tightly interwoven, and that religion can cause and exacerbate trauma. Can you give us an example of that?
Yes. So if somebody was raised in a religion or prescribes to a religion that might have this very black and white view of forgiveness, of, you need to forgive. If you don't, you're a bad person, right? Or you're not a good Christian or this or that. It can be very damaging, especially for someone who maybe has lived their life, being gaslit or minimized or ignored, to have that message. And I actually interviewed religious leaders from various groups, and not one of them said forgiveness is required. If anything, they were a bit offended by that idea. They were like, yes, we do know there are certain people that will take, religious text and interpret it that way, but that's not how they felt. They said, I would never ask a trauma survivor to forgive. If that's
Yeah.
something you wanted to address, I can aid them, but I'm never going to force it. I would never do that. But when it comes to religion, I always tell clinicians, make sure we are asking the questions of, what do you believe? What belief system do you come from? How does that impact your perception of forgiveness? Do you feel
Right.
like you need to forgive? If so, let's explore that.
Yeah, I mean, not all religions make forgiveness a requirement, as you point out in the book. And even within the umbrella of a religion, there are differences having to do with that. Um, I think probably a lot of people put pressure on us to forgive because they're uncomfortable with maybe something that happened to them, or they're uncomfortable with conflict in general, and they just don't want to they don't want to take it in. They don't they maybe they have compassion fatigue or empathy fatigue or something like that. That occurs to me. And how can the legal system trigger trauma responses? I think this is a pretty common thing that we can witness in the news. But why don't you explain that for a second?
Every day. The legal system triggers trauma every day.
Right,
And this is why some people who experience assaults and things like that don't report it. Don't seek justice, because the legal
right,
system was not created to support trauma survivors. It's not trauma informed, unfortunately. And
right,
clinicians are aware of that. So clinicians tend not to push things like that because we know that. I think especially in today's day and age, we see, trauma possibly being triggered by political things, legal things. And I always tell people, remember, forgiveness isn't justice. Those aren't the same.
you know.
So
Mhm.
yeah.
So you talk about um, therapy, helping people become safe and to get beyond their shame. But there's a particular kind of therapy called forgiveness therapy, and you point out the limitations of that. What is forgiveness therapy?
Forgiveness therapy is a type of therapy. It has a couple of models, and basically what it says is the goal is to forgive, and that is a mandated goal. So if you're going to
Right,
participate in forgiveness therapy, you need to forgive, or the model isn't successful for you. And the problem with that in trauma recovery is it doesn't give focus on some of those needed experiences like safety, anger processing, addressing shame. It just goes to forgiveness. So let me give you an example. Imagine someone who's experienced trauma is very angry. They're very angry at their abuser. They have every right to be angry, but they haven't really had the opportunity to process that anger, to feel it, to allow it to move through their body. And remember, when we embrace anger in a safe place, a lot of times it very quickly turns into something else. Usually it's grief. And
Yeah.
then our body is flooded with grief, and then we start grieving. We've moved past the anger, and now we're grieving. That's a very wonderful transition in trauma recovery. But if I'm participating in forgiveness therapy and I start to feel angry, and then my clinician says, okay, I notice you're angry, but let's move into forgiveness. Can we talk about your abuser's childhood and maybe what they went through? Can we talk about times maybe when they were angry? All of a sudden, my anger processing is going to shut down, and I'm going to focus on forgiving.
Right. And focusing on taking care of the other person. Let's talk about self-forgiveness, which you touch on in the book. And, it makes me think about, I had a friend who said to me how much he regretted some of the decisions he had made earlier in life or some of the behaviors. And he asked me, he said, what about you? Do you have many regrets? And I said, well, I don't really believe in regret. If I feel bad about something or I feel like I made a mistake, I just try to rectify it as soon as possible and make amends. And then I forgive myself. And, what do you think about that? I mean, is that, you called it elective self-forgiveness, and I love that. Tell us about that.
So I believe just like forgiving someone else, forgiving ourselves needs to be elective. It can't be forced. It can't be
Right,
mandated. It's got to be
right,
something that we want. It's got to be something that can happen organically. Now, again, in order to do that, we have to do an assessment, a fair assessment of responsibility. And this is very difficult for trauma survivors
uh-huh,
because A to B is the simplest explanation, and that's what I'm going to believe. And usually it was something about me. I did something wrong. I caused this. I wasn't good enough. Now, if some of that is correct, then we can lean into the guilt and maybe look at self-forgiveness, right? Because I might be an offender. I might need to look at that.
right,
But if it's not valid, then we're looking at shame.
yeah,
We're not
right,
looking at guilt. Guilt and shame are not the same. Guilt
right,
is I did something. It's a behavior. Shame is it's me because that's who I am. You can't
right,
forgive your way out of shame. It doesn't work. Self
right,
forgiveness can work with guilt. So, honestly, a lot of the time with self forgiveness with survivors, in my experience, has been spent trying to accurately assess their responsibility. And
right,
once that's done, we're able to figure out, okay, what is shame? What is guilt? Sometimes in the work, self forgiveness isn't necessary because there's no guilt because it was shame. For example, I worked with a 16-year-old who was convinced that he caused his mother to physically hurt him. He was 5 years old. He was
right.
convinced of it. You can never say anything else. He was able to go through this process and get to the point of, wait a minute, I was 5 and she was in her 30s. That makes no sense. It's not my fault. He didn't need to forgive himself. He needed to address the shame.
There's so much we could talk about. We're almost running out of time, but it's like, why do children assume that it's their fault and take on shame in the first place?
Because many reasons. One, it's the easiest explanation. Children do not have they don't have a prefrontal cortex that's developing. It doesn't develop until we're 26. So I consider 25-year-olds children. They
Uh-huh,
probably don't like that, but I do. And so we don't have the capability to realize that it's not us. And also, you need to understand they don't know their value. It's not ingrained. So if I have an adult that's supposed to care about me, that's supposed to take care of me, that's treating me this way, it's got to be me.
yeah.
What other explanation could there possibly be? My little brain cannot fathom that it could possibly be them.
It's amazing. Yeah. And in your book, you've got 20 trauma recovery methods. Wow. So much content, of so much useful content. And some of the things you cover are EMDR. I've never experienced that. I'm very curious about that. Do you think that EMDR is like one of the most powerful therapies for trauma survivors?
I do, but I'm biased. I'm an EMDR certified clinician, so I'm putting it out there. I'm completely biased. But I also combine it with a lot of other methods like somatic experiencing, some IFS, inner child work, things like that. So it
Yeah.
goes very well with other things. And with complex trauma, it's not a one monkey show. you need to bring in a lot of stuff as well. And so, the treatments, we can be bringing in all these different interventions. But one thing I always tell people, especially survivors, is there is not going to be one panacea. There's not going to be one method that works and that's all you need. It's usually a combination. It could be therapies, it could be holistic methods, but what you're looking for is what works for you. One thing that works for me isn't going to work for you and vice versa, and that's okay.
Right. And you also recommend attachment-based therapy, and it makes me think that anybody that's a trauma survivor is going to have an insecure attachment style. Is it possible to earn a secure attachment style coming from that kind of background?
Yes, I've seen it. Now, know that we may never be able to change what I call the default setting. That's where we kind of go first. That's where we start. But that doesn't mean that's where we end up or even how we function. So, for example, I have an anxious attachment style, meaning I'm just fine without, avoidant attachment style, meaning I'm just fine without people. I actually am. That's my default setting. But I know that's not what I need. I notice that if I go without social connections, I do get depressed. Right? I do get anxious, so I notice that. So I have been able to sort of update that to where I get to the point where I'm excited to spend time with people, and these are safe, capable people that provide value to my life. Am I ever going to be this person that I always want to see people, I never need to recharge, this and that? No, but that's not the goal.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. There's so much more we could explore, but we have run out of time. And I want to be sure to tell our listeners about your website, www.amandannegregory.com. Amanda Ann Gregory is all one word, .com. And for those who may be listening to Pathways Live on a Sunday morning and have tuned into the show late, this is your host, Paul O'Brien, producer of the visionary I Ching Oracle, an app that supports great decisions and perfect timing. So glad you're with us today and have the ability to review all the hundreds of interviews in our online archive at divination.com. Also, you can play and or share this program whenever you want via the internet or as a free podcast, and I'll tell you how in a minute. Today we've been visiting with Amanda Ann Gregory, author of the book, You Don't Need to Forgive, Trauma Recovery on Your Own Terms. And I want to say a heartfelt thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into Pathways, which is currently broadcast on KBOO-FM in Portland, Oregon. Or perhaps you have a free subscription to our podcast, which you can find at divination.com, that's spelled D-I-V-I nation.com, or by searching Pathways Radio on Paulo's YouTube channel, where you can also give us a thumbs up and subscribe. And do feel free to forward a link to your friends. So this is Paulo bidding you adieu and reminding you to tell your friends about Pathways Podcast. And thanks again to Amanda Gregory and to all of you listeners for tuning in and being a part of the Pathways conversation.